Thank you. Thank you, Gordon, to be here. Gordon Fyfe is honorary fellow of... I lost it. What is it? Okay. He's honorary fellow at the Kilo University, and he's been managing editor of the Sociological Review, and a founder of online museum research journal, Museum and Society, that I think is very interesting, museum online magazine. I've seen it, it's very, very interesting. And he's a member of the board of Museum History Journal. He has his publication, he has published many essays and books. Two of them are, for me, very interesting because I saw them and I find that they have very intriguing titles. The first one is Art, Power and Modernity. That's very interesting. And the second one is Theorizing Museums. It's very, very interesting. With Sharon MacDonald. Okay. Gordon Fyfe will talk about museums, the sociological imagination and the imaginary museum. Another intriguing title.
Thank you. I'll try. I will do my best. Yeah, I think my talk is something by way of an invitation to come to the University of Kiel and visit an archive. I'll try and persuade you that this would be an extremely interesting thing to do. Archives aren't necessarily at first sight the most fascinating places to visit. But I do need to tell you, by the way, that Kiel is near a place called Newcastle under Lyme. And before I go any further, I must clarify the fact that there are at least, I think, 3 Newcastles in my country, or in the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. One is, of course, Newcastle upon Tyne. If you go there, you will meet Rhiann and Chris. If you come to Newcastle under Lyme, you might meet me. And I have distributed a handout about the archive, which tries to give some of the background. Now, MeLa clearly brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the museum and places the notion of contact zones right at the center of the project. And it's partly that when I was asked to come and talk here, it's partly that engaged my attention, because I do think the notion of a contact zone is apparently simple in its significance, but enormously powerful, I think, as an analytical tool for thinking about museums. Partly it's important because it I think, as a concept, aims to challenge the notion that museums are nothing more than conduits of a dominant ideology. That's one of the things it does. And as I understand it, MeLa is committed to challenging the received wisdom that museums are essentially conservative institutions whose function is little more than to conserve the power of the past in the interests of contemporary elites and states. As I understand it, MeLa believes that this is a rather one-sided view of the museum, insofar as it comes to define our appreciation of all that museums can accomplish. I'm reminded, for reasons I won't explore here, but I am reminded of the observations made by the great social geographer Lewis Mumford in the late 1930s, when he argued that the museum provides the means of coping with the past without confining our activities to the molds created by the past. It's that sort of double side of the museum which I think is important. This is why the concept of a contact zone, I think, is so useful. The concept, as you know, derives from anthropology, from the work of Mary Louise Pratt and James Clifford. And it has, to my mind, the enormous virtue of releasing our imagination from determinism and answering the question, when do museums happen? My own reading of Clifford it may not be Clifford's reading of Clifford, but my own reading of Clifford, is that museums happen, clearly as Clifford says, they happen when there is an encounter between two cultures that generates the need for collections, which illuminate the relationship between the two cultures in some sense. And the bit that I think, I'm not sure whether Clifford would agree with this or not, but what I think both Clifford and Pratt point to is that you simply cannot stop museums happening. They just simply are. They're kind of modernity. They just bubble up, it seems to me, out of modernity and out of the process of modernization. Just as perhaps sport does. And I wonder in some ways whether one might say that with modernity, museums are to collections as, for example, sport is to games. I mean, there is something transformative vis-a-vis museums that relates to modernization. What I want to do here is to bend the light a little so that we focus on the museum as contact zone between disciplinary cultures. And my lens is the archive I've just mentioned to you. And the archive is called the Foundations of British Sociology, and it relates to the story of British sociology in the early 20th century. It also, as it happens, relates to Britain's oldest sociological journal, the Sociological Review, founded in 1908. Both archive and journal are located at Keele. Now, what has prompted me to talk about this archive is its relevance to matters of interdisciplinarity and museums that concern this conference. Before doing that, though, let me perhaps reflect briefly on my feelings about the relationship between sociology, my own discipline, and museums. And I'd like to simply identify three characteristic ways in which my discipline has engaged with museums. One might say there's something called the institutional critique, something which is associated sometimes with reflexive modernity, and there's what I would call here a kind of partnership model. To go through these fairly quickly and speedily, the institutional critique I think you'll all recognize. It's not simply a sociological intervention into museum studies, I realize that. Its roots go back perhaps to the avant-garde and quite deep into European attitudes to museums anyway. But certainly in relation to sociology, a lot of researchers have explored, in recent years, have explored the tension between, if you like, rhetoric and reality, the rhetoric of the museum's universality and the reality of, for example, its visitor profiles. I mean, that's been part of the trade, the sociological trade in investigating museums. And here, of course, we know that museum visiting does appear, particularly in art museums, does appear to be refracted through class. And one thinks immediately of the classic mid-20th century research of Pierre Bourdieu, his pioneering work on the nature of museum visiting. In their different ways, a number of scholars, and I'm thinking of quite different scholars, but a number of scholars, Tony Bennett, Sharon MacDonald, Nick Pryor, and others, I think have helped us to understand how it was that Europeans came to imagine that nation states were composed of sovereign individuals, and how this was taken to represent the most civilized and normal way for people to be associated with each other and to bond with each other. We know, I think, from the work of people like Sharon and Nick Pryor, the complicity between that notion of normality and the rise of the museum is certainly there. And this research, I think, is very significant, partly because it suggests an association between the museum and what you might call, I would call cultural amnesia. And I'm thinking here of the kind of amnesia that the German sociologist Norbert Elias identifies when he observes in The Civilizing Process, his book, The Civilizing Process, that by the end of the 19th century, he says, European elites had simply forgotten that their civilization had actually been acquired. They forgot that they'd learnt it en route from being a warrior nobility to being courtiers and then to European bourgeois classes. They forgot that their taste, their rationality, their intelligence were not natural attributes of individuals whose way of life was naturally superior to other people. They've forgotten that. And I think one of the things that Tony Bennett does, and again, it's not the way I think he would express it, but one of the things he does is to help us to see how that amnesia was accomplished. And I think the museum, in a way, is the missing link in Elias's story, I think, of the civilizing process in Europe. So that's the first, bit, way in which sociology relates to the museum as a critique. The second I would call reflexive modernity. Quickly go through that. You're familiar with it, I think, but I take the term from Anthony Giddens's work on postmodernity. But this idea that the museum perhaps is postmodern in the sense that it has become almost intrinsically sociological itself, that museums have begun to consume social science, to use social science, like a lot of other institutions, and that social science becomes part of the operation of the museum as it becomes, along with other institutions, reflexively modern, forced for one reason or another to continually reflect on its own procedures.